Hi, we are going to be talking about biology today. Biology is the study of life. Okay, the problem is, what is life? Look at the examples I'm giving you in there. You have bacteria, you have fungi, you have plants, you have animals. Life is very diverse. So how do you define life? Don't let that bother you. Scientists have been arguing about that for a long time. And they came up with a number of characteristics that all living beings share. Any organism that doesn't have these characteristics is not alive. So here I have a short list. Because of time constraints, I'm just going to move on to explain each one of them. Okay? So organisms are organized, very well organized. You begin with the cell, the smallest, most basic unit of life. So let me give you an example. You have the cell that forms the muscle in your heart, so that's called a cardiomyocyte. Cell, cardiac muscle. Okay. Now, some organisms may have only one cell, unicellular, some have multiple cells. But if you have multiple cells, similar cells group together to form tissues. So if you have a bunch of cardiomyocytes together, they're going to form cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle by itself wouldn't do a whole lot of good for you, but different tissues come together to form an organ. So your cardiac muscle and some epithelial tissue and some maybe connective tissue, nervous tissue, they all come together and they're going to form the heart. That'll be the organ. Again, the heart by itself, you need blood vessels. So different organs come together to form an organ system. In this particular case, when you have blood vessels, blood and all of that, you get the cardiovascular system. But of course, you are more than a cardiovascular system. You have a nervous system, digestive, blah, blah, blah. So all of the different organ systems come together to form an organism, or in this particular case, you. So you can see how well organized organisms are. Organisms respond to stimuli. And the question will be, what is a stimulus? Because stimulus is plural. And a stimulus is any change in the environment or any event that causes an organism to react. Okay? In this particular case, we'll talk about external. We'll talk about internal stimuli in the second half of this course. But an external stimuli causes an organism to move towards the stimulus or away from it. Okay? There's a variety of mechanisms, obviously depending on the particular organism, and a large part of the behavior is going to be the particular movement. What is the point of all of this? Well, the organism is going to move either to avoid injury. Let's imagine you step off the sidewalk and a car blows the horn. You jump back into the sidewalk to avoid being run over, right? It can be acquiring food. You come in the house and it smells like your favorite dish, and you go right into the kitchen. Who's cooking? I want to eat, I'm hungry. Or it can be married. You see a particular person and say, hey, this person looks real nice, I'd like to meet him or her. Here you have an example of a Venus flytrap. The stimulus is the fly touching some hairs inside the trap. The response is going to be the trap closing, and now the plant acquires food because it's going to digest that fly. Organisms reproduce. Nobody lives forever, right? So they need to reproduce, and of course later on they have to develop. How that happens depends on how complicated the organism is. Bacteria, single-cell organisms, usually they're split in two. Can be a little bit simpler or more complex, but basically it's just split in two. But when you talk about multicellular organisms, usually what we're talking about is an egg and a sperm that come together, they form an embryo, and that embryo is going to develop, it's going to grow according to the information containing the genes that inherited from the parents. And just for the time being, we're going to say the genes are made up of DNA. We're going to have several chapters just on genes and DNA, so don't worry about it for now. organisms have the capacity to adapt. Let's face it, the environment on the Earth has been changing. Think about glaciations, when part of the Earth was covered with ice. There was warm periods too. I mean, scientists have found tropical plants under the ice in Antarctica. At some time, Antarctica had tropical climate. So some individuals of some species are going to be better fit. An adaptation is all of the features that makes a particular organism better suited to the particular environment they're living in. When the environment changes, then maybe a different adaptation is required. One thing that I like to mention is these adaptations, I mean, modifications are usually present. There's a moth in England that is either light color or dark color. And before the Industrial Revolution, the trunk was white because of lichen. So there was a lot of white moths because the black moths were very visible and the birds could eat them. During the Industrial Revolution, when the tree trunks got darker, it was easy for the black moths to hatch, so there was more of them. After environmental laws were passed and the trees turned white again, there were more white moths again. But there was black moths and white moths all along. It just changed the ratio. Okay? This is important because the individuals that are better adapted, they're going to live longer, they're more likely to reproduce, so of course there's going to be more of them. So natural selection is defined as the differential reproductive success, which one reproduces the most. Okay? Basically, the survival of the fittest. That's another way to put it. Okay? And of course, if you look at the population, you see changes in the population. But just keep in mind, with very few exceptions, those changes were there. All you changed was the ratio. Do you have more of this or more of the other one? So evolution is really the change in frequency of traits that usually are pre-existing in a population. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about evolution. Don't worry. This is my favorite example of adaptation, the polar bear. Polar bears live in a very cold environment. Well, they have a special kind of fat, brown fat. Fat stores energy, but it's usually energy for the cell, for the organism. Brown fat, there's a little disconnect in the cellular respiration, so it produces mostly heat. It has a built-in here. Of course, the polar bear also has a thick fur and a layer of fat to insulate him. The fur is white, so it blends with the environment, because what does the polar bear eat? Seals. They have to get close enough to a seal, or else the seal jumps back into the ocean. So the white bear is harder to see, and polar bears have been seen actually rubbing snow over their black noses to help disguise themselves. And if all of that wasn't enough, they have a genetic mutation because the diet of the polar bear is mostly fat. The seal has a lot of blubber because it's swimming in ice cold water. So that diet would kill anybody else. Anybody who ate a diet mostly fat will get high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, blah, blah, blah. Polar bears have a mutation in the metabolism of fat that allows them to eat a diet that's mostly fat without problems. Organisms have to grow and develop. Growth refers to the increase either in size or the number of cells. Size is rare. Most of the time we're talking about increasing the number of cells. Let's face it, at conception you was one cell. Now you are anywhere between 30 and 40 trillion. So the number of cells has increased dramatically. But if you look yourself in the mirror, you are not a blob of cells, are you? No. You can see eyes, and you can see your mouth, and you can see hair. So the changes that take place between conception and death, that's what we call development. And cells are going to adapt, and their shape, size, the proteins they make, they're going to be different depending on the role. For instance, if you have a red blood cell, it's going to have a disc shape, and it's going to make a lot of hemoglobin, that's the protein that carries oxygen. But if you're a muscle cell, for instance, you don't need hemoglobin. In fact, you don't want to be round. So you're going to form a fiber long and narrow, and still hemoglobin. What is your job? My job is contracting, so it's going to make contractile problems. And this is really fascinating when you study at the gene control level. Organisms have multiple regulatory mechanisms to coordinate their functions. Let me give you an example of the heart. Everybody knows the heart pumps blood. Now, you're going to run a race, you're going to run a marathon. You need a lot of energy. Where do you get energy from? From cellular respiration. Cellular respiration requires oxygen. So your heart is going to speed up to pump more blood to bring more oxygen. So you have the sympathetic nervous system that accelerates your heart rate. On the other hand, think about it, it's nighttime, you're finished, you sit in front of the TV, and all the exercise you're doing is channel surfing. You're just using your thumb to change mood channels. That doesn't take a lot of energy. So the parasympathetic nervous system slows down your heart rate because you don't need the extra energy, you don't need the extra oxygen. So by having multiple regulatory mechanisms, your heart is able to perform perfect for any particular situation. Organisms are homeostatic. That's a big word, nothing to worry about. It means staying the same. Organisms maintain an internal environment that's relatively constant. Relatively means that it allows for a minimum change, okay? It's just like the thermostat in your apartment or in your house. It doesn't stay fixed at a certain temperature. When it reaches a certain temperature, the air comes on. When it cools off enough, the air comes off. So look at the body temperature in humans. It's very low in the mornings, increases during the day, usually highs in the evening, and then at night it decreases again. But if you could read the graph and I realize it's too small, you talk about 1 degree variation between the highest and the lowest temperature. That's not a big change. Finally, organisms have to acquire materials and energy to maintain the organization to carry on the life's activities. Energy is very easy to understand. There's a capacity to do work, but you need materials. You need materials to extract energy from them sometimes. You need materials to grow, to replace cells that are worn out or too old. So the main source of energy on Earth is the sun. We have organisms called producers. These are plants that take carbon dioxide from the air and sunlight, and they produce glucose. Now, this glucose is used by plants to make a number of molecules, and they take some nutrients also from the soil. Animals can either eat the plants, like the bunny rabbit, or they can eat other animals, so they're called consumers. But you can see how the energy is being passed from the sun to the producers to the consumers, as well as the materials that pass to. Every time you're changing from one level to another, there's going to be a little bit of a loss in the form of heat. When the plants or the animals die, there's another group called the decomposers that will break down the materials, release some heat, and now you have materials once again for the consumers, for the producers, sorry.